going to devote the balance of the hour to the Secretary of State's race, the only statewide contest without an incumbent. We call this a debate, but it's an informal affair with no podiums or timed responses. Now, a quick word about who we've invited. When we have debates in Almanac and independent polling exists, we use a 5% inclusion rule. In races like this one, where there is no third-party polling, we generally invite all candidates on the ballot to participate, and that's what we're going to do tonight. Bob Helland is the Independence Party candidate for Secretary of State. Bob Odden is the standard-bearer for the Libertarian Party. Dan Severson is running as a Republican for Secretary of State. Steve Simon is the DFL nominee for the post. Welcome, one and all. Dan Severson, you know, Minnesota has a reputation of having a clean, honest electoral system. You have said that the system is corrupt. What leads you to say that?
Well, you know, I was in the legislature in 2008 after the Franken-Coleman recount had taken place, and I got notified by somebody who was up in the northern part of Minnesota and started to tell me a long tale about some of the stuff that she had been doing as a poll watcher there and some of the things she'd seen. And as I got into that investigation, I came to realize that we really have a non-responsive system to allegations of voter fraud. It was very frustrating because I, as a sitting representative, couldn't get any answers to that process.
But is the system corrupt?
Well, and I think it's open to corruption, and I think it's there's enough cases as I went around to speak to, you know, run for the office that people were relaying to me that it told me that there was some significant concerns in that whole process.
Kathy, I don't think Minnesota would be first in the nation in voter turnout for 9 out of the last 9 elections if everyday Minnesotans thought the system was corrupt. To the contrary, we get very high marks, not only from the outside, but from citizens in Minnesota as well. So I think it does a disservice to everyone, the county auditors, the auditor treasurers, the election judges, to say that our system is corrupt. In need of improvement, of course. In need of reform in some areas, of course. But we've got a pretty good thing going here, and I don't think you junk a whole car just because the taillight's out.
We definitely will talk about some reforms.
Yeah.
Yes, Mr. Helland.
Well, I agree with Mr. Simon that we do have a secure system. We've got a good thing going, and I'm proud to be a part of the state that does have this representation. But besides the administrative and legal issues, we've got this cultural idea of elections, and the idea that, you know, it does concern me, and I do think there are elements that we need to address when candidates are restricted from participating in the debates, like Hannah Nicollet. Our governor candidate's been excluded from several debates, including the TPT debate coming up in 2 weeks. So, you know, the cultural component of elections is something we need to address to make sure that all candidates are getting fair representation and good information is making its way to the voters.
Bob Odden, what do you think of the election system, the voting system in Minnesota?
Well, up at, was it up to 2008, no one would probably have questioned it. But when people brought allegations, they had gone through the database for voters and then found irregularities and notified him, I guess maybe a couple months or so prior to the November election in 2008. And all he did was hold a press conference and say, nothing wrong here, don't look behind the curtain. That's a problem. And that creates an idea within people's minds that maybe there's something there that they should know about. And then, of course, we had the Norm Coleman and the Al Franken close race, and so that kind of fed into that. Now, I think, you know, I would analyze the voting system based on, you know, I'm an engineer, I analyze problems, and I look, you know, for ways that something could go wrong. The absentee ballots throughout history have had a history of not being done properly, because there's no chain of that you can follow through with the ballots.
You made some changes in absentees.
But what I was going to address in terms of the 2008 race is, on this very couch, I believe, a frequent guest of yours, Fritz Knock, who was the chief counsel, or one of them at least, for the Coleman recount effort, said that they, and all sides really, looked high and low in the 2008 recount for fraud. They spent millions of dollars on each side to find those kinds of irregularities that could have tipped the balance, and he himself, having Representative Norm Coleman, said they couldn't find any. Now, that's not to say there aren't irregularities from time to time, but we do have a good thing going in Minnesota, and we ought to always keep the doors open to participation and not slam them in people's faces. That's the key thing with this office.
And Dan Severson, you've been talking about maybe having an audit of the electoral system?
Yep, and I think that would be appropriate as we go into office, is basically to say, how does this office perform, and what are the vulnerabilities? And one of the first things you do in a, particularly for the military, we would go into an organization, you need to do an audit of the organization and see where its strengths and its weaknesses are. And in this particular case, I think one of the things that we can go in and say, what are the vulnerabilities in same-day registration and vouching? And so the vouching is really the kind of the part that I think puts huge vulnerabilities into this system. You know, the Minnesota majority had done a study, and there was a privately funded study that basically came up, and they testified before the House committee in January of 2011 and gave the information out that said there were 6,224 ballots in which they could not account for. They didn't know where these people came from or where they lived. They didn't know what it was about. So that's, and then you've got 1,009 felons who voted, just as Bob was talking about when Secretary Ritchie was challenged with the information beforehand, 2 months before. There was a assurance that that was going to be taken care of, and it wasn't.
I saw Mr. Helen kind of nodding your head there for a brief
Well,
moment.
yeah, I worked at the Department of Revenue for 5 years, so audit is a word that certainly is a hallmark of my experience. And anyone coming into a new agency, whatever you want to call it, audit, inspection, getting under the hood and really tinkering around and figuring out how all this stuff works, there's going to be multiple dimensions of it. There's the technology aspect, there's the legal aspect with the new legislation that's coming in, and again, there's just this kind of idea of sending that information out to the public and making sure that they're familiar with these systems and processes just as well as we might be.
You know, people who are new to the state of Minnesota, when they first come here, they do think vouching is a little different, that they've not run into it before.
Right.
Is there a door that opens that could maybe lend itself to fraud with vouching?
Well, I know my neighbors and they know me. And particularly in greater Minnesota, I think they take great offense at the notion that vouching is sometimes or somehow a vehicle for fraud. My own father could not have voted in the 1998 election had he not been vouched for, because my parents, when my sister and I left the house, they downsized, they moved to a new place, they didn't have a utility bill, they sure didn't have ID, so he couldn't have voted in that election. It's what we do in Minnesota, it's worked very well, and I think that's one of the reasons we're so much imitated, so much copied, so much envied around the country. Access to everyone who's eligible to vote. Period. That's what we should always be pushing for. The best secretaries of state do. It's about making sure that eligible voters can vote and not slamming doors in their faces with things like photo ID or the new and improved photo ID or other sort of versions or warmed over kind of notions of photo ID.
I want to talk about photo ID, access to everyone. This is an interesting article, I don't know if you all saw it, in the Star Tribune this morning about sex offenders at Moose Lake, the treatment center, actually having a voter registration drive, those that can vote. These are felons who serve their time. About 20% of the registered voters in Moose Lake are these folks who are in the treatment facility. Are you comfortable with that, having that happen, Mr. Auden?
Well, I didn't read the article. I don't take the Star Tribune, so I'm really not quite familiar with what you're talking about.
Okay.
But how about it? There is a problem with the vouching system because people do vouch for people that they don't know, and there's no way to prove it because you don't know those people. If you don't find out if they're eligible prior to their voting, then you can't follow up on it. And I think we should be to help ensure the integrity of the system. We should be determining people's eligibility prior to vote, because once they vote now, whether it's illegal or not, it goes in with everyone else's vote, and there's no way to take it out.
Getting back to the felons for just a moment, how should felons be re-enfranchised?
Well, we had a great conversation about it at our last forum at Minneapolis Community and Technical College. Steve at that time had pointed out that there's 2 states, Vermont and Maine, I believe, that allow anybody at any point to vote. And it's a discussion that the people need to have, and they need to put it through the proper channels through their legislature or legislator to achieve what the will of the people is. And rather than step on a bully pulpit and try to tell people what I think it needs to be, I can obviously represent what I think is good for democracy, but that's the people's choice, and they need to work through their legislators through the proper channels of the Constitution.
Mr. Stevenson.
Yeah, and I agree with we are a country of rule of law, and our Constitution basically sets the parameters in that position, and so it really says that felons can vote once their civil rights have been restored. I think the glitch comes in making them aware when those civil rights have actually been fulfilled, and they're ready to be restored. That's the challenge, and so there are a number of things that we've kind of looked at in order to do that, but I agree. The Constitution says we want to re-enfranchise them. We want to bring them in, and in order to do that, you sit them down, you say, okay, your penalty is complete. You now have your right to vote come back. If we want to move it to a different position, as Bob said, you've got to take it to the people to have them say, you know what, we think it ought to change, because it's in the Constitution. Verbiage isn't going to work.
But what's really key there is, for a low-cost way, we can get at the people who are voting and shouldn't, who perhaps are felons. There are very few of those cases in Minnesota. I mean, a minuscule, microscopic level. But when that happens, for very little money, we could tell people what their rights are. And by the way, it goes both ways. There are people, very few, who accidentally vote who shouldn't. But then there's the heartbreaking cases of people who are eligible to vote and have been for many years, but are under the mistaken impression that because years ago they committed a felony, that they no longer can vote. And that's heartbreaking. People who discover, after many years of not voting, that they were eligible all along. But in either case, for very low cost, we can tell people in a more forceful, more efficient way what their rights are. I think that's a civil rights issue and something we should pursue, for sure.
If we determined people's eligibility ahead of time, before they voted, if they're a felon and can't vote, then we could tell them that. And then therefore they wouldn't have voted, and therefore they would not have committed fraud. The state has to take some responsibility for this.
Let's talk about voter ID. The state constitutional amendment question went down.
Yep.
You supported it.
I did.
You've got a new plan it's kind of an express lane for folks that want to use a driver's license to identify themselves, and they would get a faster line. Is that kind of the idea?
Yeah, and the idea is you take about half of the lanes or polling slots to go with voluntary photo ID. You use the other half for the conventional method, the way we use it right now. It's interesting because when you go to the store, what are all the stores doing now? They're doing express lanes. If you got 8 items or less, you go into the express lane. If you want to do a self-checkout, you go to that self-checkout, and you don't have to stand in line with somebody who's got a huge basket full of goods to do that. Why wouldn't we give our voters that same option and say, you know what, everybody's got an ID card, and so why not use it? Why not get around that line? Because there's people that are waiting. They may have to register. They may have problems with their address. There may be something on the voter roll that keeps them plucked, right in that spot. And so if there's somebody that is in a hurry and their time is valuable, they should have the option to go into an express lane where all they have to do is show their ID card, slide it through, and get their ballot.
Well, last April, in an interview on cable TV, Dan said, of those who didn't have the ID, which is a large percentage of our population, larger than you might think, he said that, well, if they don't have an ID, then they can just wait outside in the cold for a couple of hours. You can check it out on YouTube. He said that in a cable interview. I think not only is that tone not really befitting of a Secretary of State who's supposed to earn the confidence and trust of people who don't agree with him, I think that kind of caustic sarcasm it has no place in the Secretary of State's office. And I think it's also harsh, overly partisan, and a little extreme, I think, for Minnesota.
Yeah, and I'm not sure what video you're talking about, because that didn't have anything to do with express lane voting. If it was, it may have. I don't even know what you're talking about, Steve. But the bottom line on it is, I was a poll watcher in this last election cycle. And I went down to Cedar Riverside. I went down to the Brian Coyle Center down to the Seward neighborhood, where lines were out the door all day long. And in the evening, it got very wet and cold. In fact, it was an interesting evening because I was poll watcher down in Seward Center, and all of a sudden this commotion breaks, and here's Phyllis Kahn talking to the election judge. Well, it was a violation of law to start with, because she can't be in there unless she's trying to vote. But the other part was that she was talking to the election judge saying, can we get these people inside? Now, I commend her for really being concerned about his citizenry, but laws are put into place for a purpose. And so part of this process was to say, you know what, we could have brought those people in. We could have gotten those who were already qualified through a much faster.
But if you have a separate but equal system like that, however, whether it's intended to be or not, I think that really creates a separate class where none need exist. If you had one line, and you had people with an ID and people without an ID in some sort of electronic poll book situation, that's different. But treat them separately, and to make comments that they can wait in line for a couple of hours. I think that's.
I refute that, Steve.
I got to say, one of the things about being Secretary of State that's the most important thing, even more than policy, I would say, is having the trust and confidence of people who you might not agree with and who might not agree with you. And to show that you can work in a bipartisan, even nonpartisan fashion with a lot of people, and that means being respectful of other people's views, it means not making fun of people.
I need to jump in at this point and reiterate that it's not the Secretary of State that's going to achieve photo ID. Again, there's proper channels, and this goes through the legislature, and it's, in effect, the people's choice who they elect and what they want. With fraud in the election system, policies don't stop fraud. policies help, but we have people and we have technology and we have partnerships. And from someone like myself who's worked in the state government for 5 years in the actual areas of fraud detection and fraud prevention, that's the type of experience we need, not kind of political proselytizing on what the law should be, because that's a legislative function and I want to execute this office in that capacity.
Mr. Udden, are you in favor of photo ID?
The voters turned it down. And I will say that, I mean, just being in a line, another line, does it mean that I'm going to be stigmatized the rest of my life, because I'm not in the fast and express lane? But I don't know why, people now could show their ID that would speed things up, that would help to make sure that, their information is registered properly, that there's no transcription errors and so forth. It would be of a benefit to everyone. Now that they have these systems where, the Secretary of State's office database does connect with the Driver's License Bureau, why can't they put a little photo of the person right next to their name? I mean, they have all that information, so that when they came in to vote, all you have to do is then look at the photo and that's that person.
Is this a cost-effective measure to prevent that, though? And I mean, Steve talks about it a lot. The cure is worse than the disease, and it's hard to put a cost on a lot of these very high technology and new policies that kind of
Can I
very
just say,
new.
though, if the issue is efficiency and cutting down on lines and wait times at the polls, there are two other better methods, in my view at least. One is the new law that we have in the books that I wrote. I worked on for 7 years, which is the new no excuses absentee voting law, or vote by mail. We just had the Secretary of State's office announce a record of people who are voting by mail, who are registering for absentee ballots or getting absentee ballots. That's a good thing. That's going to take pressure off of Election Day. Any one of us now can vote from home, from our couch, from our kitchen table, doesn't matter. So that's good, and I'm proud of that. It's my proudest accomplishment in elections. The second thing would be to go to straight up early voting, where you take the pressure off of Election Day by having a 1 week or 2 week period of early voting. 33 states, including red states and blue states, all the states that surround us, Wisconsin, Iowa, the Dakotas have it. We ought to as well.
What do you think of that?
Well, I want to take it in a little different direction here, because Bob was talking about, about the photo ID and about how voters rejected in the last election. And it's interesting that Phyllis Kahn has seen the light on photo ID. It was one of those deals where she had a competition for her seat down there, and all of a sudden it broke out into a fist fight. 2 weeks later, she moves it off-site, and then she requires a photo ID for all of those delegates to actually participate. Well, okay, that was okay, but now what happens? We go to the primary. She still can't win her primary, and then we go to the primary, and all of a sudden they find 130 voters voting out of one place.
What about, curious about what you think about early voting? Is there such a thing as too early to vote, perhaps?
I believe that restricting it probably to about 2 weeks before the election would be appropriate. Yep, and I'm an advocate of everybody that's eligible being able to vote, making it as easy as we can, because that's our civic duty, to choose our leaders, and everybody needs to participate in that process. That's why I'm a big fan of the express lane voting.
Yeah, but the ballot measure that the voters said no to, that you championed so passionately, Dan, would have made us the worst in the country, worse than Mississippi. Even Mississippi had the compassion, and you don't hear those two words in the same sentence all that often. Even Mississippi had the compassion to put an exception in their law for those in assisted living or seniors in nursing homes. Ours didn't. It would have been a disaster for seniors in the state. So that's shutting doors in people's face, and we need to be opening them, not shutting them.
Quick comment there, Dan Severson. I want to go over to Mr. Helen.
Yeah, I think the legislature has the purview to, and it was in that particular bill that basically says the legislature designates what are acceptable means of identification. And so that was something that was laid aside for the legislature to determine. And that's where the misinformation was on many levels. In fact, they said the military would be disenfranchised. Well, the military votes at 15%. 15% right now. How do you disenfranchise anybody more than 50%?
But according to the Secretary of State's numbers, in 2012, the military votes at 76%.
76%.
By the Secretary of State's office.
Yeah, I'd have to look at those numbers.
Yeah, back to the original question, which was about the no excuse absentee ballot, which I commend Representative Simon for writing. The concern I have is we all talk about the need to have an independent, nonpartisan executive in this office to oversee these laws. When I hear Representative Simon talk about for 7 years pushing this, and it's kind of a signature bill of his career, is he going to be independent and objective if elected to be able to say, oh, this part of this bill was a bad idea? We need to have someone that's willing to make that call. And I come from a world of separation of duties, accountants, where you don't both do this and then oversee it. We've got to be aware of that.
Since my name's been invoked, can I respond?
Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a fair question, a good question, and the answer is yes. And one of the things I've enjoyed about being in the legislature is having those bipartisan relations. You know, in this particular area of policy, as I know Eric and Kathy, you know, the governor has said, and Governor Pawlenty before Governor Dayton had said in less clear terms, that the expectation was you could only get election stuff passed if you had bipartisan support. Only if you had broad bipartisan support. And I, working with many others, was able to do that. So on day one, I'll have very good relations, I think, with Democrats and Republicans in the legislature, because that's what I've been able to do over my last 10 years in the legislature. So independence, yes, for sure.
Steve wrote a bill that practically destroyed third parties. He wanted to have move up the primary, and for some reason the petitioning period is connected to the primary date, and so that we would get more attention here in Minnesota nationally during the presidential election. Well, that would have put our petitioning period into March. We get frostbite in March.
Bob, the reason for that bill is to accommodate our overseas military folks, and the Pentagon and others were telling us that we really needed to do that, and I was proud to carry that, because those folks often get shortchanged.
Well, I'm just trying to say that, no, you didn't discuss that with us. You know, you talk about, oh, bipartisan. Okay, well, it's more than bipartisan. Come on. You're trying to do away with third parties. You're not listening to us. You're not giving us adequate ballot access. We have the shortest time period for getting petitions. Our petitioning period right now is not favorable. You know, if this was to go to court, you guys would lose. I mean, Minnesota has the toughest laws on the books for getting third parties on the ballot.
We're running short time. You have made a point of the business service aspect of the office, which I guess is much, if not most, of what the office does.
Yeah, we should talk about restoring the full function of the Office of Secretary of State and stop talking like legislators running for an executive position. That's not what we do. There's a lot of things that we need to be good at. We need to be skilled at. We need to be able to work with a very diverse set of partners. And for the business services, that's involving several agencies in the streamline of setting up a business in the state, which we're doing very well on elections, but how well are we doing on new businesses and private sector job creation? This role is an ambassador, reaching out, reaching young people, reaching immigrants, reaching people of all ages and all backgrounds, and that's what I'm going to do. That's what my experience was at Revenue, and that's what we need.
I wish we had more time with you all.
Me too.
Yeah,
That was great.
good job. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having us.
Obviously, this ran a little long tonight, so don't worry. We'll be back next week with our Minnesota history questions. We have